Imagine this. A powerful millionaire, who could buy anything he wanted in life, suddenly falls in love with a humble maid. But instead of saying yes, she looks into his eyes and rejects him. Why? Not because of pride, not because of class, but for a reason so heartbreaking, and yet so pure, that when he finally discovers the truth, his entire world comes to a standstill. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will move you to tears. Laura Miller had learned to move through the world without making a ripple. At 5 a.m. sharp, long before the first train rattled down the tracks, she eased out of bed in her modest two-room apartment on the south side of Chicago. The floorboards creaked if you stepped on them wrong, so she stepped right, heel to toe, the way her grandmother had taught her, so a sleeping child wouldn't stir. She filled a dented kettle, set it on the stove, and lined up 2 chipped mugs. One for black coffee, one for chocolate milk. A lunch bag waited by the door, a peanut butter sandwich for Daniel, a banana if it hadn't bruised, a note she'd scribbled at midnight when she got home, 3 words and a crooked heart, proud of you. She checked the homework folder once more, then breathed in, slow, steady, until the knot in her chest loosened. "Time, Mama?" came a husky whisper from the bedroom. "Almost," she called back. "2 more minutes and I'm bringing the cavalry." "You always say that," Daniel said, appearing with that rumpled-haired courage only 10-year-olds possess, already tugging on the zipper of his hoodie. His socks didn't match, blue stars on one foot, a plain gray on the other, and somehow that made Laura's eyes sting. She pressed the hot mug into his cold hands, and the apartment filled with steam that smelled faintly of cocoa and hope. "You ready?" she asked. "For what?" he grinned. "For greatness? For being kind," she countered. "Greatness comes and goes. Kindness sticks." They ate at the small table that wobbled unless you wedged a folded flyer under one leg. Through the thin window, streetlights hummed above a block already awake, the night shift custodian trudging home, the crossing guard lighting a cigarette, the baker propping open the back door to let out heat. Laura watched the neighborhood stir, and told herself the same thing she told herself every morning: today can be better. On the chair beside her sat a worn folder containing a printed email, interview confirmation, Whitman residence, 9 a.m., and a resume she'd revised a dozen times. She had ironed her one good blouse and practiced her answers in the mirror after Daniel fell asleep. The words "ma'am" and "sir" still clung to her tongue from the Texas childhood she'd left behind. Sometimes they came out, sometimes they didn't. She hoped the man interviewing her wouldn't mind either way. "Mama, are you really going to work in a rich man's mansion?" Daniel asked, tapping his straw against the mug. "If I'm lucky," she said, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from the folder. "It's in Lake Forest. Big house. Lots of windows. A garden, I think." He hesitated. "What if they don't like me when I visit?" Laura pushed back her chair and knelt to his eye level, the way she always did when it mattered. "People with money don't get extra hearts, baby. Just one, same as us. And the size of a person's heart isn't tied to the size of their bank account. If anyone forgets that, we'll remind them, gently." He nodded, absorbing it like sunlight. He always did. They walked to school through a wind that blew off the lake and knifed through layers. Laura held Daniel's backpack strap when traffic snarled, and he held her hand when the light took too long to change. At the corner, he stopped and looked up. "Be brave," he said, echoing her line. "Be kind," she finished. He ran toward the door, turned back once, and flashed her a thumbs up that she put in her pocket to keep for later. The first bus came late. The second bus swayed like it had opinions. As the city rolled past her window, the Chicago she knew, brick 3 flats, faded murals, stoops with plastic chairs, gave way to a version of Chicago she mostly saw on magazine covers in the checkout line: high hedges and ironwork gates, driveways that curved like sentences, modern glass that caught the morning sun and held it hostage. Laura watched the skyline shrink in the side mirror and forced herself not to fidget with the seam of her coat. She arrived a half hour early. "Better early than sorry," her grandmother's voice said. The Whitman estate rose ahead, 3 stories of clean lines and quiet money. The kind of house that didn't shout about itself, it simply assumed you knew. A security camera whirred to attention. A discreet intercom blinked. Laura pressed the button and folded her cold hands. "Yes?" crackled a voice. "Good morning. Laura Miller. I have a 9 o'clock interview." A pause. Then the gate sighed open as if deciding she could pass. A driveway unfurled under a canopy of oaks toward a front door broad enough to welcome a wedding party. She caught her reflection in the glass, cheeks flushed with cold, hair pinned into a careful bun, the cheap blouse looking almost elegant under a borrowed coat. She straightened, set her shoulders, and knocked. The woman who opened the door was of indeterminate age in the way that capable women often are, silver hair in a tidy twist, posture like a ruler. Her eyes, bright and appraising, softened by a fraction when they took Laura in. "You must be Ms. Miller." "I'm Mrs. Henderson," she said. "House manager. 15 years. Come along." The foyer smelled faintly of lemon oil and new paper. Art hung on the walls, not just expensive, but curated, as if each piece had been chosen to say something precise. Sunlight pooled on the marble like warm water. Laura kept her pace even, fighting the urge to shuffle so her soles wouldn't squeak. "Mr. Whitman is in the main hall," Mrs. Henderson said, leading her past a music room. A grand piano slept under a closed lid, a library, books in crisp rows, a ladder on rails, and a glass-walled garden where white orchids hovered like moths. "We keep a private household but a professional one. The family values privacy." "Clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Laura said, and the "ma'am" landed softly enough that Mrs. Henderson pretended not to notice it. They entered a room that could have hosted a gala. At the far end, a tall man in a navy suit stood by a console, sifting through a stack of documents. When he looked up, the room seemed to recalibrate around the line of his gaze. "Ms. Miller," he said. "Andrew Whitman." His voice carried the restrained timbre of someone accustomed to being listened to. Up close, the impressions layered, the clean shave, the careful suit, the faint silver along his temples that suggested time had left its autograph. But it was his eyes, storm gray, attentive, and, if you knew to look, tired in the way grief makes you tired. "Thank you for coming," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for seeing me," Laura replied, matching his grip, steady, not tentative. She sat where he indicated and placed her folder on her lap so the corners wouldn't fray. He scanned her resume quickly, the way people do who can read more than words. 2 years with a reputable cleaning service, excellent references, a night class and office administration that she hadn't been able to finish when the sitter fell through. The paper said one thing. The neat lines, the unsmudged ink, the margins that breathed said another, a person who cares. "This is not a small house," he said, setting the resume down. "It takes a team to keep it running. The position is full-time. We rotate duties, but you'll need to be comfortable with high standards." "I prefer clear standards," Laura said. "It's easier to hit a mark you can see." Mrs. Henderson's mouth twitched in something like approval. "There's another element," Whitman said, and the syllables softened. He didn't look at Mrs. Henderson. He looked past Laura, toward the garden, as if finding the words there. "My son, Gabriel, is 8. Laura waited, not filling the silence, not rescuing it. A good listener leaves room. "His mother died in a car accident 2 years ago," he said. "Since then, he's withdrawn. Nannies haven't lasted. He doesn't speak much to adults. He spends hours in his room. He reads. He wakes at night." He reached for a pen, set it down. Reached again. Didn't pick it up. "I'm telling you this because it affects the household. We require discretion and patience. Grief recognizes its own." Laura felt it like a tuning fork, the way a certain look says more than a paragraph. Abandonment had taught her the language of quiet pain. Single motherhood had taught her its grammar. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, not as a script, but as an offering. "And for his." He inclined his head, the smallest concession. "If I were hired," Laura continued, "I'd respect his space. Children who've lost someone need control over at least one thing: their pace. You can't tug a flower open. You give it light and time. Mr. Whitman's attention sharpened. You could almost hear it click. Mrs. Henderson's brows rose a millimeter. Do you have children, Ms. Miller? He asked. A son, Daniel. He's 10. Just started fractions and thinks they're personal, she said, a breath of humor that didn't try to be charming and therefore was. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Light, halting, not quite sure. Laura didn't turn. You learn not to startle wary animals or wounded hearts. A boy paused on the final step, small for 8, in a dinosaur t-shirt and lounge pants, hair rumpled the way sleep leaves its fingerprint. He clutched a book to his chest like a shield. Gabriel, Mr. Whitman said softly. This is Ms. Miller. Laura didn't rise. She slid forward in her chair and lowered her chin just enough to meet a child's line of sight without cornering him. She kept a measured distance, the respectful kind. Hi, Gabriel, she said, voice even and unbright. That's a serious book you've got there. Looks important. He lifted it a fraction. The spine read, Dinosaurs, a visual encyclopedia. Do you have a favorite? Laura asked. Silence stretched. The house held its breath. Mrs. Henderson studied a speck on the console as if it demanded her entire soul. Triceratops, Gabriel murmured, so soft the word nearly dissolved. He stared at the floor as if the floor might interrupt him. It's gentle. But it has horns. For, you know, if someone tries to hurt it. That's good design, Laura said. Gentle is stronger than people think. Horns are just backup. A pause. Then, a small, shy glance up. It wasn't a smile, not yet. But it was the kind of glance that says a door has cracked open in a quiet hallway. Mr. Whitman's shoulders lowered a degree. Mrs. Henderson found that the speck on the console had miraculously vanished. Would you like to see the library, Ms. Miller? Gabriel asked, surprising even himself with the question's bravery. I would, Laura said. If your dad says it's okay. It's okay, Mr. Whitman said, his voice clearing. Mrs. Henderson? I'll join you, she replied, and then, graciously, did not. The library smelled like old paper and patience. Gabriel slid the encyclopedia back onto a lower shelf that had been arranged with ruthless precision, by period then by species. He hovered near the ladder, not climbing, but touching the rung as if to check it still lived where he'd left it. My mom played the piano, he said to the air, as if the room, not Laura, needed the information. Before bed. Laura let the sentence settle. My grandmother sang while she worked, she said at last. Said chores don't feel like chores if the song carries some of the weight. Gabriel looked at the piano through the doorway. We don't open it. Sometimes lids stay closed until someone asks nicely, Laura said. Pianos are stubborn like that. A sound, almost a chuckle, escaped him before he could leash it. He startled at his own reaction, then held still, testing whether the world would punish him for it. When it didn't, the corners of his mouth lifted a single degree. From the doorway, Mr. Whitman watched the exchange with a mix of awe and ache. Something unfurled in his face, equal parts relief and fear of hoping too soon. Back in the main hall, he cleared his throat. Ms. Miller, he said, the formality hanging on by habit. If you're available to start Monday, we'd like to offer you a trial period. Full-time. Competitive salary. Benefits. Clear expectations and room to grow. Laura swallowed. Trial meant promise without guarantees, but promise nonetheless. Rent paid on time. New sneakers before Daniel's toes found the end. Bread without checking the unit price twice. I can start Monday, she said. Earlier if needed. Monday is good, he replied. Mrs. Henderson will show you the service entrance and staff schedules. Discretion, punctuality, and consistency matter here. So does kindness. Those are the parts I'm best at, Laura said simply. As Mrs. Henderson led her toward the staff corridor, Laura paused at the threshold and, without turning, glanced at the piano. The long black lid waited, a sleeping animal in a sunlit room. Gabriel, half hidden behind the door jamb, watched her watching it, then raised a hand in a small, tentative wave. Laura lifted her fingers in answer, gentle first, horns only if needed, and followed the house manager into the wing where clocks are set 5 minutes fast and everything has a place. Behind her, Mr. Whitman stood alone in the shining hall, one hand flat on the console, as if steadying himself against the sudden tilt of hope. Laura showed up on Monday at 7 a.m. sharp, the sky a pale wash over Lake Forest, the air smelling of wet stone and boxwood. She wore the same pressed blouse and a heavier cardigan, hair pinned back, a tote on her shoulder with neatly labeled caddies of supplies she trusted, old habits from a dozen different houses where familiarity meant speed. Mrs. Henderson met her at the side entrance, the staff door tucked beneath a pergola veined with dormant wisteria. "Punctual," the house manager said, approving without saying the word. "Let's get you oriented." They began in the kitchen, a cathedral of stainless steel and sunlight, with a 12-burner range, a double-wide refrigerator, and a pantry that could outlast a snowstorm. Everything was labeled with printed tags, spices, pasta, baking, except the drawer with handwritten cards that read Gabriel's favorites. Granola, apple slices, peanut butter, cheddar cubes, tiny pretzels in a sealed jar. "We keep his snacks where he can see them," Mrs. Henderson said, softer than before. "If you ask, he'll say he's not hungry. If you place a plate near him, it's gone in 10 minutes. They moved through the service corridor to the laundry room, where 2 industrial machines chugged quietly like content animals. "Uniforms and linens by day," Mrs. Henderson said. "Family laundry at night. Whites on Tuesday, darks on Friday. Bedding every other Wednesday unless there's an incident." They walked the route Laura would eventually trace from memory, the mudroom with cubbies for shoes, the garden room with a wall of orchids, the gym where everything gleamed but nothing seemed used, the office with its precise stacks and expensive pens, the great room that drank light like water. In each space Mrs. Henderson explained not only the how, but the why, and Laura listened the way she listened to people, for rhythm, preference, and the seams where care could be tucked in unnoticed. They ended in the library. Even in daylight, it felt like a sanctuary. Shelves rose to the ceiling, a rolling ladder inviting but off-limits without permission. The grand piano's lid remained closed, polished to an obsidian shine. A framed photograph on the console held a happy moment in amber. Andrew Whitman, younger and less guarded, an arm around a blonde woman whose laugh looked like a bright sound you could almost hear. Between them, a toddler Gabriel reached for the camera as if eager to grab the future. "Mrs. Whitman," Mrs. Henderson said, noticing Laura notice. "Helena. 2 years gone." Laura inclined her head. She didn't ask questions she wouldn't want to answer herself. At 9:30 a.m., Mrs. Henderson handed Laura a laminated card, a sample day, then stepped back. "You'll learn the cadence," she said. "It's like a waltz. Don't try to dance all 3 steps at once." Left alone, Laura stood in the doorway of the great room and took in the battlefield, fingerprints on glass, a faint trail of crumbs beneath the sofa, a throw blanket folded on the wrong diagonal. She began the way she always began, in a corner, working outward, small wins building toward visible transformation. She polished without chasing shine, reset pillows without erasing the indent where a head had rested, cleared a table but left the paper crane someone had folded from a napkin. A house, she believed, should look occupied by people, not staged for a realtor. The first hour passed quietly. At 10, a soft tread moved down the stairs. Laura kept her head angled, not turned, aware without staring. Gabriel hovered in the doorway, hair mussed, dinosaur t-shirt replaced by a navy sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. "Good morning," Laura said, still smoothing the edge of a rug. "You sleep all right?" A micro shrug. "The kind that says both yes and no." "Mrs. Henderson says the library is your favorite room," Laura added. "Mine too. Books behave if you ask nicely." He did not smile, but he drifted toward the library anyway, like a moth who won't admit it's heading toward light. Laura let him go, finishing the great room, then following at a distance that wouldn't feel like pursuit. In the library, Gabriel sat cross-legged on the rug, an atlas of the night sky open in front of him, finger-tracing lines between constellations. Laura dusted the lower shelves, humming under her breath the way she always did, not to fill the space, but to make it breathable. A hymn without words, something her grandmother had hummed while shelling peas at the kitchen sink. "What song is that?" Gabriel asked, not looking up. His voice came like a sound from behind a door. "Something my grandma used to hum," Laura said. "She said work goes faster if a tune takes the heavy part. My mom played the piano," he whispered, eyes flicking toward the closed lid. The confession made his face flinch. Laura pretended not to notice the flinch, only the fact. "She must have been good," Laura said. "She said Chopin made your brain stronger and your heart softer." "Smart woman," Laura answered. "I could use both." Silence, comfortable this time. Laura wiped the edge of an end table with a barely damp cloth, careful with the wood, careful with the moment. By 11, the house smelled faintly of lemon oil and warm air. In the kitchen, Laura assembled a plate, apple slices, a triangle of cheddar, a handful of pretzels, and slid it onto the table near where Gabriel had planted himself with a book about Cretaceous predators. She set her own glass of water across from it, and took a seat, not facing him straight on but at a polite angle. "Do Triceratops eat apples?" she asked. "They were herbivores," he said, no longer whispering. "They probably ate cycads and ferns. Would they judge me for eating cheddar? They didn't have dairy," he said, and then, unexpectedly, snorted. It was almost a laugh. Almost. He reached for a slice without admitting hunger and chewed while reading, then reached again. Laura kept her eyes on her rag-wrapped water glass and said nothing that would interrupt a good thing. At noon, Mrs. Henderson set out turkey sandwiches. "We take lunch in the kitchen," she told Laura, then turned to the boy at the threshold. "Unless certain people are making a special exception today." Gabriel hovered, torn between habit and invitation. Laura pushed her chair back half an inch. "I promise to avoid boring adult questions," she said, solemn as a judge. He slid into the chair across from her, knees not quite touching the underside. "What counts as boring?" he asked. "Asking how's school, without wanting to know," Laura said. "Or telling you to use your words when you already used them." He considered. "That is boring. Then we'll skip it." They ate in a small circle of easy talk, dinosaurs, a meteor shower he'd read was coming in late August, the difference between a nebula and a galaxy. Laura didn't pretend to be an expert. She asked honest questions and listened to honest answers. Mrs. Henderson sliced strawberries, saying nothing, but her eyes gave away the soft astonishment of a woman witnessing a drought end. After lunch, chores resumed. Gabriel orbited Laura the way a wary cat learns a new person's footsteps. He drifted through rooms where she worked, and without comment began to help, handing her the small brush for the picture frames, lining up coasters to match the faint ring in the wood, carrying folded throws to the basket at the hearth. They worked in parallel, the way people do when words aren't ready but company is needed. At 3, Laura discovered a dust bunny the size of a small troop beneath the sofa and made a show of coaxing it out with a long brush. "You can come with me," she murmured to it. "But only if you keep your promises." Gabriel blinked. "What did it promise?" "Fewer bunnies next time," she said. "Union rules." He cracked, properly this time, into laughter that startled him so much he slapped a hand to his mouth. The sound rolled through the room and settled in Laura's chest like a bright marble. Near 5, tires crunched on the drive. The house adjusted itself the way houses do when the person who pays the bills comes home. Laura was vacuuming the last stretch of the upstairs hall when she heard a voice, deeper than in the morning, loosened by the day, and the quick patter of small feet. She shut off the vacuum, coiled the cord, and carried it to the closet, giving father and son the first minute that matters. Downstairs, she found them in the great room. Gabriel stood in front of his father, eyes bright, speaking quickly in a way that seemed to surprise him as much as Andrew. "And she knows about Orion, Dad," and she said pianos are stubborn but we can ask nicely, and we ate in the kitchen, and she knew the right brush for the frames, and did you know there's meteors in August? Andrew listened as if the earth itself had changed its spin. When he looked up and saw Laura standing at the archway, his expression carried gratitude untrained enough to be raw. "How was your first day?" he asked. "Good," Laura said, wiping a not quite existent smudge from her palm with a cloth she didn't need. "Your son is an excellent librarian." Gabriel stood straighter by a fraction. "We usually keep dinners formal," Andrew said, a line of habit. "But I was thinking, tonight, maybe the kitchen table?" Gabriel's head shot toward Laura. "Please?" She hesitated. Lines existed for reasons, professional ones she respected. But she also knew when rituals needed to be rewritten for a house to breathe. "If Mrs. Henderson approves," she said. From the doorway, the house manager arched an eyebrow that meant, "I already set 3 plates," and retreated to the stove. Dinner was simple: grilled chicken, roasted carrots, buttered noodles, and therefore perfect. The conversation kept falling into the easy channels they'd opened at lunch. Andrew asked questions not to be polite, but because the answers interested him, and Gabriel, emboldened by the kitchen and the company, offered corrections that made his father grin into his water glass. When Laura mentioned the meteor shower, Gabriel lit up. "We have a telescope," Andrew said. "On the terrace." "We don't have to," Laura began. "We should," Andrew said, decisive without being pushy. "If you're willing." They climbed to the roof terrace, where twilight painted the lake a deeper blue. The telescope stood under a fitted cover beside 2 lounge chairs and a folded blanket. Gabriel removed the cover with the reverence of a boy who still believed in magic and swung the cylinder toward the southeast as if he'd done it 100 times. He had. "There," he said, adjusting the focus. "Orion's belt. It's faint this time of year, but you can see it if you're patient." Laura took her turn and leaned into the eyepiece. Stars gathered themselves out of the gray like shy guests stepping into a lit room. "Oh," she breathed, the word a small cloud. "My mom said each star is somebody who loved you, watching to make sure you remember how," Gabriel said, not quite looking at either adult. The night swallowed the words and offered them back brighter. "She was right," Laura said low. "And she'd be proud of how well you remember." Andrew watched his son's profile in the dim. He hadn't seen this particular expression, unguarded, present, in so long that it startled him. He tucked the blanket around Gabriel's shoulders and, after a pause, around Laura's too. She tried to protest. He shook his head, once. It felt less like generosity and more like balance being restored. They stood that way for a while, orbiting each other in companionable silence, the air cooling, the city lights building a horizon. Eventually, Gabriel yawned so wide his eyes watered. "Bed," Andrew said, and the boy, unusually obedient, nodded. In the hall outside Gabriel's room, Andrew paused. "Ms. Miller," he said, voice running quieter. "Thank you for today." "Thank your son," she said. "He did the brave part." Andrew looked like he wanted to say more, then thought better of it. "Good night, Laura." "Good night, Mr. Whitman." She descended the staff stairs to the side door, stepping into the hush of early night. On the bus back to the city, her reflection hovered in the window, a tired woman with a full heart. She texted Daniel, "On my way. Tell me everything." A minute later, the 3 dots pulsed, then his reply came back in a cascade. "I aced the fractions. Ms. Lopez said I was a natural. Can we get pizza Friday?" "We can," she typed. "Proud of you." Across town, in a house too quiet for 2 years and suddenly not quiet at all, a boy slept with a dinosaur book under his pillow. In the room below, a man stood in a doorway and stared at a piano he hadn't touched since the funeral, wondering, for the first time in forever, whether lids stay closed because no one asks them to open, or because no one believes they'd sing if they did. By the second week, Laura could find the light switches in the dark and the good dish towels without looking. She learned the faucet that squeaked, the stair that complained, the way the library's west windows threw a bright square on the rug at 3:40 p.m. She didn't chase shine for its own sake, she aimed for a lived-in order, pillows fluffed but not staged, blankets folded the way a child's hands could unfold them easily, picture frames aligned to the nearest memory. Gabriel's orbit tightened. He began to appear where she was, on the kitchen stool while she rinsed berries, in the hall while she wiped the banister, at the library threshold while she dusted the baseboards. He asked questions that arrived sidelong. How long does lemon oil last? Why do some stars twinkle more than others? And Laura answered as if each question were important because to him it was. On Wednesday, she slid a plate of apple slices beside his book, and, without looking away from the page, he nudged a slice toward her. On Friday, he carried the folded throw to the basket without being asked, then stood taller as though a very small ceremony had just appointed him deputy keeper of order. Mrs. Henderson watched the thaw with wary hope. "He ate with us," she reported to Andrew one evening, as if delivering the quarterly numbers. "Sat the entire time." Andrew came home earlier the next day and the next after that. He found excuses to handle things that a personal assistant could have done. Deals could be negotiated over the phone. Spreadsheets traveled. A son's voice telling him about Orion did not. Dinner migrated from the formal dining room to the kitchen table, then to the terrace on soft nights. Conversation, once a sparse landscape of yes/no, sprouted questions, opinions, corrections, laughter. Laura never took over. She set tempo and then stepped back, letting father and son find their own rhythm again. When Gabriel said, "Dad, did you know Laura's grandma hummed hymns while she worked?" Andrew smiled into his water glass and said, "That's a good system. Maybe we should hum during homework." The piano stayed closed. Until the afternoon Laura dusted it and left a small rectangle on the music stand, an easy arrangement of Claire de Lune she'd found among Helena's books. She didn't say a word. That night, after Gabriel was asleep, Andrew stood in the doorway for a long time, then lifted the lid like a man opening a room he'd kept shut. His hands hovered above the keys and came down on the simplest chords. The house held its breath, then breathed with him. Saturday brought Daniel. The boys met in the library like two foreign countries deciding whether to exchange ambassadors. Daniel pointed at the lower shelf. "Your dinosaur taxonomy is next level," he said with a kind of 10-year-old respect that counts for everything. "You color code by period?" Gabriel nodded, stunned that someone noticed. "Want to see the telescope?" They climbed to the roof terrace with Laura and Andrew close behind. Daniel pressed his eye to the lens and announced that Jupiter looked like a marble suspended in soup. Gabriel laughed, unrestrained this time, and launched into a tutorial on Galilean moons. Laura leaned on the rail, the lake flashing like hammered metal beyond the trees, and felt a heaviness leave her shoulders she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Back downstairs, Laura and Mrs. Henderson cooked side by side, roasted chicken, green beans with slivered almonds, buttered noodles because boys are boys. Daniel set the table, precise about forks and knives in a way that made Mrs. Henderson say, "You can come back any time," which for her was the equivalent of a hug. Andrew opened a jar of lemonade and poured for the boys, then poured water for Laura the way men do when pouring wine would say too much. It became a ritual. On certain evenings, Daniel would come by after school, the four of them sharing an hour that felt strangely like a family that had remembered it was one. Andrew told stories that had G-rated edges sanded on, Daniel bragged about fractions, Gabriel admitted he'd drawn A.T. Rex with feathers, and Laura, careful, constant, kept the train on the tracks without letting anyone feel guided. Laura noticed, too, the quiet shifts. Gabriel slept longer. He joined them for breakfast twice in 1 week. He asked, tentatively, if he could learn to play the pieces his mom had loved. 2 days later a gentle piano teacher arrived on the dot at 4, shook Gabriel's hand like a colleague, and began with posture and notes. By the end of the third lesson, the first 8 measures of Claire de Lune floated down the stairs. Andrew stood in the hall and cried silently, one hand against the doorframe the way a person steadies himself in a swell. Work bled into feeling for Andrew in ways he didn't bother to disguise from himself. He woke easier, left the office earlier, reached for his phone less. He began to notice small things about Laura, The way she checked her room's corners before its center. The way her laugh arrived late, like it waited to make sure it was welcome. The way she listened as if listening were an art that required practice. He found himself making tea at night because she drank it, keeping good honey because she took a spoonful, stocking the freezer with popsicles because Daniel liked them and Gabriel would only try one if Daniel did first. It was early August when the light turned thick at 4 o'clock and the house felt suspended between seasons. Laura was in the library, reshelving the stack of books the boys had mined, a field guide to meteors, a dog-eared dinosaur encyclopedia, a slim volume of poems that had been Helena's. She wore a navy dress, nothing fancy, but it fit her like something meant for her, and she tied her hair into a low ponytail that showed the clean line of her neck. Andrew paused in the doorway, undone by the domesticity of it, the ordinary holiness. He didn't speak immediately. He listened to the soft slide of paper against paper, the tiny thud of a book meeting a shelf. Sunlight came through the glass and landed on Laura like a benediction. He realized, suddenly and fully, that the feeling he'd been escorting around the edges of his days was not convenience or gratitude. It was love, uncomplicated and catastrophic. "Mr. Whitman?" Laura startled softly when she finally saw him. "I didn't hear you. I didn't mean to lurk," he said, the corner of his mouth tipping. "It's just nice seeing this room used. Libraries prefer fingerprints," she said, half-smile returning. "They're proof." He stepped in, stopping with polite space between them. "How are you liking it here?" he asked, the question larger than its words. She set the last book in place and faced him squarely. "I like the work," she said. "I like the people." "Good," he said, then exhaled, as if lowering a weight. "Laura, I'd like you to know, you're not just an employee here. Not to me. Not to Gabriel. You—" he searched for a word that wouldn't sound like a confession. "You've become part of what makes this house feel like a home again." Heat rose in her face. She wished it wouldn't, then let it. "Thank you," she said, steadying the syllables. "That means a lot. Call me Andrew," he added, almost gently. "Please." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Silence spread, not empty but charged, the kind of silence that could tip either way. Laura felt the ground shift beneath her just enough to warn her, and just enough to beckon. For a breath, she allowed herself to imagine the ease of saying yes to every unspoken thing in the room, the dinners at the kitchen table, the boys bickering over star charts, music floating down a hallway at night. She felt the sweetness of it like warm bread held in both hands. Then she remembered the rules she kept for herself, the lines she'd drawn in invisible ink. She took a half-step back to where duty was clear. "I should get the guest room dusted before the piano lesson," she said softly. "Of course," he replied, polite closing over vulnerable. "Thank you, Laura." He moved aside to let her pass. As she did, the thin chain at her throat caught the light and flared for an instant, one bright spark, and then gone. In that flare Andrew saw the shape of everything he hoped for and the hint of a storm he didn't yet understand. Down the hall, Laura paused to steady a picture frame that didn't need steadying. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Outside, the lake darkened under a sudden wind, and somewhere above the roofline, a new front gathered itself, clear sky to the west, bruised to the east, promising a weather change no one had forecast. By early September the house had a new pulse. Breakfast happened at the kitchen island, not as a duty but as an anchor. Afternoons drifted into piano practice. Evenings telescoped into roof terrace stargazing or board games where Gabriel argued about the rules and then laughed at himself for caring so much. Andrew found reasons to come home early and, increasingly, reasons to linger. The shift showed in small ways. A bowl of lemons appeared on the counter because Laura liked the way they brightened a room. A new step stool materialized in the pantry after she mentioned, offhand, that top shelves were built for tall people with long arms. In Andrew's office, a framed photo moved from the corner of his desk to the center, Gabriel grinning, a smudge of graphite on his cheek, Laura blurred in the background, half-turned, humming. On a Friday night, Andrew said, almost casually, "There's a family place in town, brick oven, red-checked napkins. Would you and Daniel join us? Just the three of us. He caught himself. Four of us, if Daniel's free. Laura opened her mouth to decline on principle, lines, propriety, distance, but Gabriel's hopeful face wrecked her plan. Please? We never go out together. I'll wear a real shirt, he added, dead serious. She smiled despite herself. A real shirt sounds persuasive. I'll see if Daniel can come. They went. The place smelled like tomatoes and heat. Gabriel and Daniel negotiated a truce between pepperoni and plain, landing on a half-and-half compromise that made both feel magnanimous. Andrew asked questions that let the boys be large. What are you building with those Legos? What does Jupiter look like in the scope this time of year? Laura answered the softer questions directed her way. How do you take your tea? With honey. What's your favorite season? Fall, when the light gets honest. Driving home through streets lined with old trees, Daniel fell asleep in the back seat, his head tipped toward the window, mouth slightly open in the universal posture of exhausted children. Gabriel fought sleep and lost, his hands still curled around a napkin-wrapped breadstick he'd declared too good to abandon. Laura watched them in the rearview, then looked over and found Andrew looking at her. He's happy, she said, meaning Gabriel. So am I, he answered, which she pretended not to hear. In the garage, as the car cooled and the boys stirred awake, Andrew lowered his voice. Can I ask you a personal question? You can ask, she said, wary but not closed. Have you ever thought about starting over? With someone? The words came careful and unpolished, like a truth carried too long. The question landed in Laura's ribs like a knock. She held his gaze a heartbeat too long, felt the yes rise, terrifying and clean, and pushed it back down. We should get them inside, she said softly. It's late. He nodded, the gentleman's retreat. Of course. 2 nights later, after the boys were down and the house had found its hush, Andrew found Laura in the kitchen, stacking cooled baking sheets she'd used for roasted carrots. He stood on the other side of the island, like a man who'd rehearsed and decided to risk forgetting his lines. Laura, he said, I want to say this right. She didn't move. Didn't rescue him. Just waited. 2 years ago I lost my wife and... He stopped, corrected himself. Gabriel lost his mother. Since then I've run this house like a project. Tasks, schedules, metrics. I thought efficiency would save us from feeling. And then you arrived, and the house began to sound like a home again. My son laughs. I laugh. The piano lid is open. The lights are on for reasons other than security. He exhaled. I love you. The words didn't echo, they settled. They fit the room the way a piece finally finds its place. Laura closed her eyes. She had known. Since the library that afternoon with the sunlight and the dust motes, and the way he said, Call me Andrew. She'd known. She also knew the other thing, the thing she had not said, would not say, that turned this confession into a cliff edge. Andrew, she murmured, and the name cost her. I care about you. About Gabriel. About this house. But we can't. Because I'm your employer? We can navigate that. Because of the difference in money? I don't care. Because people talk? Let them. It's not about gossip. She gripped the rim of the baking sheet. We're from different worlds. You solve problems with resources I can't imagine. I solve them with time and stubbornness. Those differences don't disappear because we want them to. Differences are logistics, he said, almost smiling. We can manage logistics. What we can't manage is pretending this isn't real. He stepped around the island but kept a respectful distance, hands at his sides, nothing reaching. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm asking you not to run from an answer you've already found. She swallowed. The world narrowed to the soft mechanical hum of the refrigerator, and the way the under-cabinet lights haloed his shirt cuffs. For one wild second she pictured mornings that began together, evenings that folded into piano music and homework and a roof terrace where stars arrived on time. The image was so vivid she could have stepped into it. She set the baking sheet down with care. "We should keep our lines," she said. "For Gabriel. For Daniel. For everyone." Something shuddered behind his eyes, a window closing in bad weather. He nodded once, not in agreement but in understanding the conversation was over. The next week reconfigured itself around the unsaid. Andrew reverted to leaving before sunrise, returning after bedtime. His absence scratched at the walls like a small animal. Laura doubled down on the visible work: baseboards, pantry shelves, window tracks, tasks that left no room for thinking. She smiled for Gabriel and meant it, then went downstairs and braced her hands on the stainless counter until the room stopped tilting. Gabriel felt it first. Children always do. "Laura," he asked over algebra worksheets one afternoon, "did I do something?" "You. Never. Dad looks, the way he looked after the funeral. Like he's here but not all the way." "He's busy," she said, hating how thin it sounded. "Are you going to leave?" The question was so quiet she almost missed it. She pulled her chair closer and took his hands, ink-smudged and warm. "I am not going anywhere, Gabe. You hear me? I'm right here." He searched her face like a map. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." Mrs. Henderson said nothing until she did. In the laundry room, where machines spoke in low vowels and steam made halos of everything, she handed Laura a stack of warm towels and spoke to the dryer door. "Men are fools," she announced. "Also women. Also everyone with a heart." Laura folded a towel end to end and then into thirds. "Noted. He's miserable," Mrs. Henderson said. "You're miserable. The boy notices everything. It's not that simple." "It never is," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "And it's also exactly that simple." Laura smiled without humor. "Thank you for the paradox." "You're welcome," the house manager said, like a priest granting absolution and a warning simultaneously. In the mirror each morning, Laura noticed other changes and refused to name them. The color that had drained a shade from her cheeks. The ache under her ribs that came and went like a tide. The way she sometimes had to sit down after climbing a single flight of stairs, then stand up and pretend she'd been looking for a misplaced cloth. "Tired," she told herself. "Autumn tired." Andrew tried work as a cure and found it didn't cure. He returned home one evening to find a slice of notebook paper on his desk and Gabriel's blocky print: "We ate spaghetti. Laura says tomorrow is library day. Can we open the piano lid again?" He held the note the way a person holds a lifeline and then, as if a decision synced inside him, he began a campaign built of gestures instead of arguments. On Monday, a small bouquet, zinnias, not roses, appeared on the kitchen island with a card in his tight handwriting: "Thank you for making this place kind." On Wednesday, a battered book of poems found its way to the library table, a ribbon marking a poem about choosing to be brave when gentle would do. On Friday, a square tin of butter cookies hid in the drawer where Laura kept microfiber cloths. Under the lid, a note: "For emergency sugar only. Approved uses: fractions, piano, hard days." Laura laughed when she found it. She cried, too, quietly at the sink. Then she put the tin on a shelf where Gabriel could reach it, and pretended that moving it there was just good logistics. The stalemate might have lasted all fall if not for the envelope. Andrew came home early, a luxury he allowed himself like a stolen hour, and found Laura in the living room, straightening a stack of music on the piano. "Could we talk?" he asked, and when she nodded, he extended a thick cream envelope with her name in his careful letters. She slid a finger under the flap and eased out a stack of documents. The first page bore the blue crest of a university in Chicago. Admission, part-time, School of Education, tuition paid in full. The second, a letter of acceptance and scholarship for Daniel to a magnet school that would change the trajectory of his life. The third, paperwork for a savings account in Laura's name, seated with enough to put real space between survival and choice. Her hands shook. "Andrew, I can't. You told me we were from different worlds," he said, voice even. "That you wouldn't say yes to a man whose resources made your no feel small. Consider this my attempt to remove money from the equation. You deserve a future that isn't hand-to-mouth. Daniel deserves every open door. Tears rose, hot and ungovernable. She blinked them back. This is too much. It's not enough, he said. Not for what you've given my son. Not for what you've given me. She set the papers down as if they might break. I won't be bought. He flinched. That's not what this is. It's how it feels, she said, softer now because she could see she'd wounded him. And even if it weren't, Andrew, this isn't why I said no. Then tell me why, he said, and the plea inside the question made it a prayer. Tell me, and I'll stop asking. She opened her mouth to speak the truth, the one that woke her at night with fear sitting on her chest, the appointments she'd cancelled, the blood tests she hadn't scheduled, the pain she refused to look at full in the face. She saw, in one terrible flash, how that truth would set him on fire with purpose, how he would pour time and money and hope into a battle with an enemy that didn't bargain. She closed her mouth. We don't belong to the same story, she said instead, choosing the lie that would hurt him less than the truth might. Not in the long run. He stared at her as if she'd spoken a language he didn't recognize. You really believe that? I have to, she said. A long beat. Then he nodded once. Then I was wrong about you, he said, the sentence landing with a weight he didn't mean and couldn't take back. I thought you saw people for who they were, not what they had. Laura flinched as if he'd struck her. That's not fair. None of this is fair, he said, and for the first time his voice wasn't even. But it is what it is. He gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and walked out, leaving the room carefully, like a man exiting a chapel after a service that didn't save him. Laura stood very still. Then her knees went. She sank to the piano bench and put both palms flat on the wood, willing it to hold. In the hall, Gabriel's footsteps stopped at the threshold. Laura? She scrubbed her face with her sleeve and turned, smile practiced, voice steady. Hey, buddy. Ready to tackle those fractions? He hesitated, the way children do when the air tastes different. Okay, he said at last, and came to sit beside her. They opened the workbook. They did not touch the piano. 2 days later, on a quiet Tuesday when the house smelled like lemon oil and something buttery in the oven, Laura reached for a book on the lowest shelf of the library, and the room tilted so hard she had to grab the edge of the table to keep from going down. A cold wave passed under her ribs. She waited it out, smiling at no one, telling no one, until the floor steadied. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to find Mrs. Henderson to ask, as calmly as a person can ask, whether there was any ginger tea in the pantry. The day it happened began like any other, so ordinary that later it would feel like a cruel trick. The lake threw pale light against the Whitman windows. The house smelled faintly of toast. Gabriel tracked a crumb trail from the island to the sink and back again. Laura moved through the morning with her practiced grace, collecting dishes, tucking a loose corner of a runner, humming the tune her grandmother had bequeathed to her. Only the smallest things were off. When she climbed the back stairs with a basket of folded linens, her breath shortened too soon. When she set the basket down, a cold band tightened beneath her ribs, and then loosened as if nothing had happened. She smiled at Mrs. Henderson, who frowned, and said she'd be fine after a cup of ginger tea. Sit a minute, Mrs. Henderson told her. In a minute, Laura promised, and carried the linens toward the library because the library always set her right. She never made it to the shelves. She was 2 steps into the room when the floor tilted, suddenly, savagely, as if the house had slipped its moorings. She reached for the edge of the table, missed, and went down hard, the sound of her fall a sharp, wrong note in a room built for quiet. Laura? Gabriel's voice, then the slap-slap of his sneakers on the hall tile. He found her on her side, eyes closed, breath shallow, the basket upended, pillowcases like spilled clouds around her. Dad! He shouted, voice breaking. Dad, come, please! Andrew was down the main stairs before the sentence finished. For a second he froze, the way a man freezes when memory and terror arrive together. Then he dropped to his knees, turned Laura gently onto her back, and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse at her neck. There. Faint, but there. Gabe, he said, and his voice was calm because someone's had to be. Call 911. Tell them we have an adult female, mid-20s, unconscious, shallow breathing. Library entrance is on the south side. Mrs. Henderson, front door now. Gabriel repeated the words like a spell and ran. Mrs. Henderson flew past him, already pulling the deadbolt. Andrew smoothed a strand of hair back from Laura's forehead. Hey, he whispered, as if coaxing her back from a far shore. Hey, stay with me. The paramedics arrived in a burst of competence and nylon. Blood pressure cuff. Oxygen. Questions Andrew answered without hearing himself. Name, age, allergies. The words, "Are you family?" landed like a demand. Yes, he said. There was no other word big enough. They lifted her onto the gurney. Gabriel stood at the threshold, hands clenched white around the door jamb. She'll be okay? He asked the universe. She's in good hands, Andrew said, which was not an answer and the only one he had. To Mrs. Henderson. Stay with Gabriel. I'll call. He climbed into the ambulance because there was no version where he didn't. Sirens carved a path through Lake Forest streets while Andrew watched Laura's chest rise and fall under the strap, watched the green numbers flicker on the monitor, watched a medic squeeze his shoulder once, human, brief, as if to say, hold. At the ER doors, the ambulance swallowed her into fluorescent light and slick floors and a choreography of rushing that made the world feel both safer and more precarious. A nurse pointed Andrew toward a family room with soft chairs that were too soft, walls painted in the universal color of waiting. He paced. He sat. He stood again and pressed his palms to the window until the glass cooled the heat in them. A physician entered, mid-40s, efficient kind, badge reading Patel, MD. Mr. Whitman? Yes. He took a step that was half lunge. How is she? She's stable, Dr. Patel said. She fainted from a combination of pain, dehydration, and stress on the system. We've done scans and labs. I need to ask, were you aware of Ms. Miller's medical history? The world narrowed to the two of them, and a hum he couldn't place. She's healthy, Andrew said, because Laura was motion and sunlight and the smell of lemon oil, and how could a person like that be anything but? Dr. Patel glanced down at the tablet. She has a chart with North Shore Oncology. Pancreatic adenocarcinoma, stage 4. Diagnosed in May. She's been receiving palliative care, pain management, supportive therapies. He lifted his eyes. I'm sorry. There are sentences that break a room. That was one of them. Andrew reached behind him for the chair he hadn't intended to need and sat without remembering how. For an instant his brain refused the math. May. Before Laura set foot in his house, before the piano lid opened, before Gabriel's laugh returned. All the time she'd said no, and he'd called it pride. All the time she'd walked past him steady as a metronome while the tide inside her dragged her out. Does she know I know? He managed. She suspected you didn't, Dr. Patel said gently. She asked us not to share details without her consent. She's awake now. If she allows it, we'll review options with both of you. I want to be straightforward. Late-stage pancreatic cancer is aggressive. There are clinical trials, targeted therapies, combinations we can attempt to improve quality and possibly extend time. But this is a serious illness. How much time? The words felt barbaric, but they were the only ones that fit. Every case is different, Dr. Patel said, which was medicine's kindest lie and truest hedge. Months, perhaps. Sometimes more with the right response. I'm sorry. Andrew nodded because there was a way to carry grief that let a room do its work, and he had learned it when Helena died. He followed Dr. Patel down the hall, through a smoke of antiseptic and fear, and stopped in the doorway to Laura's room. She looked small in the bed, and force snaking into the crook of her arm, hair loosened from its careful tie. Her eyes found him immediately, and softened in a way that said everything. You know, she whispered. I know, he said, and took her hand because there was no law against it. Up close he could see the effort it took to keep the pain out of her face, the humorless bravery of a woman who had been shouldering alone what should have been shouldered together. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you have a son who already lost one mother," she said, and the sentences came thin but unwavering. "Because I watched grief live in your house and I couldn't be the reason it unpacked again. Because I love you and Gabriel and Daniel too much to make you practice losing me." He bowed his head. "You don't get to decide what I can bear." "I know," she said. "But I tried anyway." He kissed the back of her hand, the place where the pulse runs. "We fight," he said simply. "If there's a door, we walk through it. If there isn't, we knock until one opens. Second opinions. Trials. Houston. New York. Wherever the science is. Even if it doesn't work?" she asked, not testing him but clarifying the terms. "Even then," he said. "Because not trying would be the only thing I couldn't live with." A nurse appeared and adjusted a line, efficient but tender. "You've got people," she said to Laura, a small blessing disguised as an observation. Back at the house, Mrs. Henderson sat with Gabriel at the kitchen table, the emergency cookie tin between them like a tiny, ridiculous raft. When Andrew called, she put him on speaker. "Buddy," Andrew said. He kept his voice steady because it had to be steady. "Laura fainted, but the doctors are taking good care of her." "Is she sick like?" Gabriel stopped, a cliff he didn't want to name. "Different," Andrew said. "But serious. Will she die?" The question came out like it had been waiting in him for 2 years. Andrew closed his eyes and told the truth with as much hope as it could carry. "I don't know, Gabe. The doctors are going to try everything. So am I. We're going to love her through the whole thing." Gabriel breathed, shaky. "Can I see her?" "Tomorrow," Andrew said. "We'll go together." The night stretched thin and long. In the waiting room, Andrew became a machine for logistics. He texted Daniel, phrased it in a way that would be honest but not terrifying, asked if he could stay with a neighbor until Laura came home. He opened his laptop and began writing names: Memorial Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic. He emailed 3 people he only called when things mattered and wrote, "I need introductions." He Googled until the words blurred and then kept going because action was oxygen. In the morning, he walked into Laura's room with coffee he knew she wouldn't drink and flowers she would pretend were too much, and keep anyway. "I talked to Dr. Patel," he said. "He'll coordinate scans and labs to send out today. I've got meetings set with teams in Houston and New York by video this afternoon. If we need to travel, we travel." Laura watched him, this man who solved problems other people called impossible, and felt a complicated rush of gratitude and dread. "Andrew," she said, and he looked up. "If fighting steals every quiet good thing from whatever time I have, promise you'll also let me sit in the sun. Promise you'll let me hear the boys argue about dinosaurs and who gets the last breadstick. Promise you won't turn my life into a treatment plan." He stepped closer and rested his forehead against hers the way a person anchors in a storm. "I promise," he said. "We'll live and fight at the same time." A soft knock. Gabriel slipped into the room, shoulders squared in a boy's version of bravery, Mrs. Henderson hovering just outside the door. He had something tucked under his arm, a cheap album with a plastic cover, stuffed with photos printed on the home printer and careful captions in pencil. "I made this," he said, not looking at the wires because if he didn't see them maybe they'd matter less. "So you don't forget. And so when you're bored you can read it." Laura patted the bed. He climbed up and pressed the album into her hands. The first page showed the kitchen table and 3 plates and a bowl of lemons. Someone, Mrs. Henderson, had caught Laura mid-laugh, Gabriel mid-eye roll, Andrew mid-something like wonder. The caption read, "First dinner when it was fun again." The next page, the roof terrace. Telescope. A blurry smear of stars. 2 boys in hoodies. Caption, "Orion is a belt, not a person." Laura knew that, but she let me explain anyway. She laughed and cried at the same time, which is a thing you can do when love and fear arrive together. "This is the best medicine," she said and meant it. Andrew sat on the edge of the chair and watched them turn pages. Chicken roasted golden. Daniel holding up a worksheet with a 100 circled at the top. A piano lid open in hands. He realized with a shock, hovering over the keys. He realized, with a clarity that widened his chest, that the life he wanted was in those pages. Not some fantasy trimmed with opulence, but a series of ordinary moments pinned like stars to a dark sky. Dr. Patel came in mid-afternoon with a team and a plan. "We've sent your scans to 2 centers," he said, nodding to Andrew. "And I've spoken with a colleague at MD Anderson about a trial combining immunotherapy with a targeted agent. It won't be easy. Side effects can be rough. But if there's a window, we'll find it." Laura listened, asked 3 precise questions, and then folded her hands. "Okay," she said. "We try. But we keep the piano. We keep the terrace. We keep the kitchen table." "Deal," Andrew said. On the drive home that evening, after Gabriel had curled in on himself and fallen asleep with the seatbelt digging a soft diagonal into his hoodie, Andrew spoke into the steady tick of the turn signal. "When she comes home," he said to Mrs. Henderson, "we adjust the house. Rails where needed. A chair on the terrace. A piano bench that doesn't make her back scream. We hire a nurse discreet enough to feel like a friend. We make room for the fight and for the living." Mrs. Henderson, who'd seen families crumble and knit themselves back together in 1,000 ways, nodded once. "I'll have it ready," she said. Back at the hospital, Laura watched the door close behind the men she loved and let the quiet fold around her. She traced the outline of Orion on the ceiling tiles because Gabriel would have approved of the metaphor. She let her finger land on an imaginary star and named it after a future she couldn't promise but could still imagine. A night on the terrace in October. A sweater, 2 boys arguing, a man at a piano, the lid open, the house breathing. Outside, the September light shifted toward gold, and somewhere a nurse laughed low and tired, and somewhere a boy dreamed of constellations, and somewhere a man drafted emails to strangers who would soon become allies. In the room, Laura closed her eyes and hummed the tune that had carried her through kitchens and laundries and long bus rides, the tune that now braided itself to monitors and 4 poles and the slow, stubborn decision to live as beautifully as possible for as long as she could. Tomorrow the calls would come. The plan would harden. The fight would begin in earnest. Tonight she held the album against her heart and let the pages warm, as if the pictures could learn her pulse and keep it. October began with lists and ended with rituals. Rails went up along the back stairs. A cushioned chair appeared on the roof terrace. A lighter piano bench replaced the old one that bit into Laura's back. Mrs. Henderson labeled a new drawer with a tidy card, meds, mornings, and hired a nurse named Maya who moved like a whisper and spoke like a bell. Houston came next, white corridors, clipped footsteps, name tags that read the names of people who had gone to war with this disease and kept going. The trial team spoke in careful verbs, might, could, sometimes, and Laura listened as if translating a language she'd only ever read. Andrew took notes in a spiral notebook, writing in block letters as if neatness could coax control. Gabriel tracked constellations out the airplane window and declared that at 30,000 feet the stars felt closer on principle. Daniel squeezed Laura's hand when the 4-tape pulled and asked the sort of questions nurses love. What does this do? What should I look for? Because doing something always made him braver than doing nothing. Back in Chicago, the house learned a new cadence. Treatment days, recovery days, days that felt almost like before. Laura slept more. Some mornings her hands shook when she lifted a mug. Some afternoons the smell of lemons made her nauseous. Maya adjusted the pillows and the timing of the anti-nausea meds with the muscle memory of someone who'd stood watch in harder rooms than this. When Laura forgot to be strong on purpose, Maya sat and let silence be exactly long enough. They kept the life they promised. At the kitchen table, algebra and vocabulary conquered the hours treatment could not. On the terrace, Orion returned to its appointed place, and 2 boys argued about whether Jupiter's bands looked more like smudged chalk or layered pastry. Some nights, when the pain ebbed to a waitable tide, Laura asked for the library. Andrew opened the lid. Gabriel played the first 8 measures of Clair de Lune, and when his fingers faltered, Andrews found the notes, as if they'd been waiting for an excuse. One evening in late November, the city blued early and the lake pressed its cold face to the glass. Laura was propped against pillows in the garden room, orchid petals standing like small sails in the window light. Andrew came in carrying tea and a courage he had decided to stop postponing. "I've rewritten this in my head 100 different ways," he said, setting the mug down so his hands were free to fail or succeed. "Every version sounds either too much or not enough. So I'll say it plain. Laura Miller, will you marry me?" She laughed on a breath that was half sob. "Andrew, we can do it here," he said quickly, as if she might bolt. "Judge in the garden room. Boys in collared shirts. Mrs. Henderson pretending she isn't crying. No headlines. Just us. I know marriage won't fix what biology insists on, but it will make true what already is. We're a family. I want to say that out loud where the world can hear." She looked past him, toward the terrace where a telescope waited like a silver sentinel. Then she looked back and the softness in her eyes was fierce. "On 2 conditions," she said, because she had learned hard bargaining from an unfair universe. "First, this house stays gentle. No one turns my days into a project plan without asking me first." "Deal," he said, immediate. "Second, Daniel." Her voice did not break, though his almost did. "He needs more than promises. He needs a father who is his on paper. If things go the way the doctors say they might, I need to know he has a home that doesn't vanish when I do." Andrew exhaled like a man told he had earned the right to try. "We'll file tomorrow," he said. "We'll do the home study, the interviews, whatever it takes. He is already my son. I'll make the world catch up." They were married the first Saturday of December in the garden room that smelled faintly of soil and soap. A judge in a navy suit stood under the orchid wall. Gabriel and Daniel wore real shirts and real ties and tried not to tug at the collars. Mrs. Henderson held a box of tissues like contraband. Maya hovered in the doorway and, for once, let the nurse and the person be the same thing. Andrew's vows were careful and spare. "I promise to keep the lid open," he said, making Gabriel choke on a laugh and the judge blink fast. "To lead when leading is right and follow when following is kinder. To make room for the fight and the living. To be a father to Daniel, today and always." Laura's vows were quieter. "I promise to choose gentle first," she said, her mouth tilting, "and horns only if needed." The room unknotted itself with soft laughter that left everyone steadier. "I promise to carry what I can, hand you what I can't, and let this house teach us how to breathe." They signed the license at the kitchen island because the piano bench felt too holy and the counter had already held every important thing. That night, after the boys were down, Laura fell asleep on Andrew's shoulder in the library while he read her a poem about winter light and mercy. When she woke, he was still there, a man who had once tried to fix life by spreadsheet now measuring hours by the rise and fall of a breath against his arm. The adoption moved the way adoptions move when people with authority decide to move quickly. A social worker came on a Tuesday, sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, and looked around a room that had been built to impress and had somehow become a place where cereal bowls and homework pencils belonged on purpose. She asked Daniel questions adults never ask children directly. "Do you feel safe? Who helps you feel brave?" And he answered without looking up from sketching Jupiter's moons in the margins. "My mom," he said. "And Gabriel. And Mr. Whitman." He glanced at Andrew, then corrected himself. "My dad." The judge signed the order 2 weeks later. In the courthouse hallway, Daniel stood under a fluorescent light and tried the word the way kids try new shoes. "Dad," he said, and when Andrew looked up, he said it again because it felt true in his mouth. The 3 of them, man and 2 boys, walked out into a wind that turned cheeks pink, and for once, everyone liked the way the cold stung. Winter gave them its clean edges. Some days were rough, fevers, scans, the math of labs that did not care about hope. Some days were the kind that make a person forgive 100 bad ones. Gabriel played through the first page of Clair de Lune without stopping, Daniel made a paper model of the solar system that wobbled and somehow held. Laura sat in the sunspot by the west window and dozed while the house breathed around her. On a brittle bright afternoon in February, Laura asked for the terrace. Pure blue sky, air like glass. Andrew wrapped her in blankets and carried her up the stairs slow as a procession, stubborn enough to be safe. The telescope was covered. The lounge chairs were cold. The boys set mugs of cocoa on the ledge and tried not to hover. "Tell me the story again," she said, eyes on the shallow winter sun. "Which one?" Gabriel asked, though he knew. "How stars are people who loved you," Laura said. "Watching." Gabriel swallowed and nodded. "They are," he said. "And if you forget, they flash a little extra." Daniel shifted closer and tucked her hand inside both of his. "You won't forget," he said, jaw set in a boy's version of a vow. "No," Laura said and smiled. "I won't." That night the pain changed. Not louder, exactly, deeper, the way thunder is lower than rain. Maya adjusted the pump. Dr. Patel came and sat with charts he didn't open. Andrew lay on the rug beside the sofa because sitting in a chair felt like leaving. The boys camped in a fort of blankets at the foot of the couch, 2 sentries who dreamed hard and woke ready. Near dawn, Laura stirred and lifted a hand as if to catch a note only she could hear. "Listen," she whispered. "I'm here," Andrew said. "You kept the lid open," she murmured, and his yes buckled on the way out. She looked at the boys, then back to him. "Promise me one more thing." "Anything." "Play," she said. "When it hurts, play. When it's good, play. When it's nothing, play. Make the house remember." He nodded against her knuckles. "I promise." She hummed the old tune, work song, lullaby, prayer, and for the first time the humming seemed to come from someplace outside her body, as if the house itself had learned it. Her breath eased. Her face smoothed. The room went very quiet, and then rearranged itself around the kind of silence that is not a lack but a presence. Spring came anyway. People brought food and stories, both of which helped. There were papers to sign and drawers to sort, and the kind of conversations that make a home feel both emptier and more yours. Gabriel took to the piano as if continuing a sentence Laura had started. Daniel learned to make her stroganoff from a recipe card worn thin at the corners. Mrs. Henderson listened to the house and decided where the framed photographs should go. The one of the garden room vows landed on the library mantel, where the light caught it at 4. On the first clear night of April, the 3 of them climbed to the terrace. Andrew with a blanket, 2 boys with a stubbornness that refused jackets. They uncovered the telescope, though they didn't use it. The sky didn't need magnifying. "Orion's moving west," Gabriel said, and if his voice wobbled, no one corrected it. "He does that every year." "Does he flash a little extra?" Daniel asked. Gabriel looked up, thinking hard, then nodded. "He does." Andrew wrapped the blanket around their shoulders and let the weight of it make a tent of them all. He looked at the dark lake, at the roofline of a house that had once been a fortress, and had somehow become a home, at the piano through the glass with its lid up like an invitation. He thought of the album on the shelf downstairs, the one that started with a bowl of lemons and a kitchen table and now ended with 2 rings and a judge's signature and a boy writing the word Dad like it was a star he'd finally located. "Tomorrow," he said, not as a command but as an agreement the night could hear. "We'll play." They went down together. In the library, Andrew lifted the lid. Gabriel sat and, without prompting, began the first measures. Daniel turned the page with the reverence of an altar boy. The house filled with a music that remembered everything, work and breadsticks and telescopes and vows and the exact sound a laugh makes when it returns after being gone too long. Outside, the constellations shifted on schedule. Inside, the promise held. And on the coffee table, laid open to a new page, an album waited for the next photograph, 3 pairs of hands on a keyboard, a lid that would not close, a home that, against every spreadsheet and prognosis, had learned how to keep singing.